In this episode, I'm speaking with fellow expats and good friends Camille and Scott Woodard. They've lived in Mexico for over a year, and I wanted you to hear their story of their journey in becoming expats. Camille is retired, but Scott continues to work as a career coach. They took a slightly different approach than my wife and I did in becoming an expat. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 305 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for a discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. In this episode, I'm speaking with my fellow expats and good friends, Camille and Scott Woodard. They have lived in Mexico for over a year, and I wanted you to hear their story of their journey in becoming expats. Camille is retired, but Scott continues to work as a career coach. They took a slightly different approach than my wife and I did in becoming an expat. Camille and Scott mentioned needing an RFC number. The current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, also known as A.M.L.O. or A.M.L.O. for short, vowed to reform the immigration and tax systems when he was elected in 2018. The RFC is the equivalent of a Social Security number. Early in 2022, the federal government required everyone to have an RFC number, including foreign residents, and that was to be completed by July of 2022. That was extended to the end of 2022, and many of us still don't have them because it requires to make an appointment at an SAT office to apply. SAT is the equivalent of the IRS. It is still difficult to get one of those appointments. You will hear Scott say that there's always seems to be one additional step or piece of data that needs to be done for every process in dealing with government processes. You have to be patient. However, before we get to the episode, let's have a word from our sponsor, Career Pivot. The Career Pivot membership community is a group of people from all over the U.S. and Canada with diverse backgrounds. This is a community where everyone is there to help everyone else out, figure out what they want to do in the second half of life, and then make it happen. Many have made changes that they did not know existed or was possible when they came to the community. They learn from each other and broaden their horizons on what was really possible. Let's hear what David had to say about being part of the community.
What I have gotten out of the Career Pivot community is really 2 phases. The first phase, I was employed, but then I lost my job for almost 7 months. So the Career Pivot community helped me, frankly, get my head on straight, to have the right attitude. It helped me go through a methodical reassessment and a process to find employment, which I did. So that was very helpful, and that's why I continue to stay. The second phase is, since that time, I have since retired. So it's a slightly different phase, but the Career Pivots community still provides ideas, engagement, frankly, camaraderie. So it's great to have that feedback and camaraderie. For me also, the bottom line is you're not alone out there. You have other people that give you ideas and perspectives and, frankly, support.
I am recruiting new members. If you are interested in learning more about the endeavor, please go to careerpivot.com/community. I want to tell you we recorded this interview in person at Camille and Scott's home. This is the first in-person interview I've done since 2019. I used my H4n Pro portable recorder and tried to be a bit more sophisticated than I need to be. Well, it didn't work as well as I would have liked, and I had to do a lot of work in post-processing to improve the audio quality. You will hear a couple of trucks pass in the background. Their home has very high ceilings and like almost all Mexican homes, has lots of hard surfaces, i.e. concrete walls and tile floors. This is not optimal for audio recording, but you'll be able to easily understand both Camille and Scott. Now on to my discussion with Camille and Scott Woodard. Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast. This is an expat episode, and I have my friends Camille and Scott Woodard, as I've done with Queen Michelle and a few other people, just simply have them tell their stories because I think everyone's story is different. And the way everyone does it is different. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's good to be here.
So first thing, what were you doing before you decided that you wanted to be an expat?
I was a drug and alcohol counselor working in a methadone clinic in Portland, Maine.
So you were a counselor.
I was a counselor attempting to save lives.
And I was a career coach in my own business with clients attempting to save their jobs. So, that's kind of what we did.
Okay. And you were in Maine. At what point did you just start thinking about wanting to be an expat, and why?
Well, it started in 2016, and initially it was because of the political climate. It sort of progressed from there, and then it became about the weather. We were both really tired of shoveling through 3 feet of snow to get out of the driveway, and we had been coming down here for...
And that was in April.
Yeah, right.
3 feet of snow.
Right. It would be dark at 3:30 in the afternoon. You know, our heating bill was $400 a month plus, and a lot of weather-related and actually lifestyle-related issues. We'd been coming down to a favorite little surfing beach on the Pacific coast called Trancones for the previous 10 years. And even though Portugal was my first place of choice, knew that it was too far, too inaccessible, too expensive to travel back and forth. And so started looking in Mexico. And the beach is my happy place, but I would not be happy, April through October. We'd have to leave. And so just started looking at the areas in Mexico that had the lowest humidity, and happened on Ajijic, started watching YouTubes, and Scott started to get kind of intrigued.
So Camille, you were the driver of this.
Was the instigator of this.
She was.
Yeah.
And she would say, I found this video, and she would name someone like Bill the Geek or Ricardo, and from retiring Lake Chapala, take a look at these and what do you think? And they were actually a great introduction to the Lake Chapala region. And that's kind of how we settled on this particular area to investigate further.
The other thing too was I looked at some other cities, but when I realized that they had a very low expat community, one of the things we didn't want was to move into an area and be one of a handful of expats and have to figure everything out on our own. And there was something comforting, although maybe a little lazy on our part, but comforting about moving into an area where we didn't have to reinvent the wheel, that we had tons of resources and people to go to, and that English, because neither one of us speaks Spanish yet, where English was more widely spoken.
Well, I mean, I like to say this is being an expat on training wheels.
Yeah, it is.
Personally, I can integrate culturally anywhere and I'll figure it out. My wife, Lotus, is probably similar to you. As we say, esposa feliz, vida feliz, happy wife, happy life.
Yeah, I think also, though, and you've talked about being able to assimilate culturally in different places like China and other areas. I think we kind of got to an age where we just didn't want to be isolated in a Mexican village, and as Camille said, figuring it all by ourselves. There are plenty of YouTube videos out there of young travelers who are doing that, but we're just kind of like, well, we're too old for that stuff, and we're ready to kind of be led along as well.
When you just finally decided to explore this, how did you do it?
So we came across this guy, Ricardo, and his wife, Michaela, who are realtors in the Lake Chapala area. And Ricardo has a YouTube channel called Retire in Lake Chapala. And he would send out these YouTube videos. And one of the things that he and Michaela started doing were what they call seminars. And you could sign up for a week, and they would take you around all the places you wanted to go in Ajijic and introduce you to the resources that you would need to get down here. Medical resources, legal resources, insurance resources, banking. What else was there? It was a lot. And it was a very concierge-driven model. And we stayed in their casita for a week. It was a week-long seminar. We had to postpone it because of COVID. So we were coming down initially in June of 2021, something like that, 20 maybe. And we ended up postponing it to October of 21. They were great, and he just drove us around every day. We found out about all those kinds of resources: medical, legal, banking. He took us to the Gringo Market, he took us to the Tuesday Organic Market, so we got a good sense of where you could get your groceries and how much they cost. I can't imagine not having done that, because it gave us a good foundation. And one of the things we did is we extended our stay here another week, staying in our casita, because what we wanted to do was leave with a place to stay when we came back in January, planned to come back in January.
And that was not easy, right?
Well, it was a lot easier than we thought, because there was this guy named Mark Miller and his wife who had just bought a house, and they were getting ready to move out of their rental. And so it became very fortuitous that they became our new best friends, and we were able to take over their lease, your guys' lease, and it just worked out amazingly that way.
But having said that, one of the things that we have found out is that there are better seasons during the year in which to find available rentals.
And we were here at high season.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Everything had already been rented.
Well, and particularly as we've gotten out of COVID, and I always joke the Canadians descend on this place like locusts in the winter. And if you want someplace in January, you need to
look the previous, March, April.
Yeah, because we came down for the summer of 2018 thinking we would find a long-term rental so we could return in January. And we were told by everybody, said, if you find something, sign the lease and start paying for it now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we were really fortunate. And it was very serendipitous how that occurred, because we didn't know each other.
No.
Even though we do similar work. But we were connected on Facebook, and you mentioned that you guys were driving back from Austin, and this whole thing about getting a new house, and I thought, geez, I wonder what they're doing with their rental. And so it just worked really well.
What has been the hardest part or the most stressful of this whole journey?
Honestly, the hardest part for me has been retirement. And there is great joy in not having an alarm clock that I have to wake up to or any place I have to be except Pilates and things like that. But the hardest part has been where to find, how to make meaning and purpose in a life that is not asking anything of me. That's been the biggest struggle.
How about you, Scott?
Yeah, so Camille's had this existential struggle. I think just getting used to a new culture, and when we met Mark, you said some pretty wise things that helped me kind of frame these experiences here. One is, you can't approach this in a very logical way, at least a U.S. logical way. This is Mexico. It has its own rhythms. You have to adjust to those rhythms. And
interrupt you, sorry. And it's not a logical process, it's experiential.
Yeah, right. And that was really helpful for me. In terms of stress, I think it's just, learning all this new stuff that you have to learn when you move. This is not our first move, but our moves have always been in the U.S. We also don't have a vehicle, and we've made a conscious choice not to get a vehicle as of now. But again, in the States, if you need a quart of milk, you go get in your car and drive down to the convenience store and pick up a quart of milk or a pint of ice cream or whatever. Camille does the grocery shopping, and she really has to think out where she's going to get what on which day, and how much can she carry back. It's not like she can go into town with, the SUV and load up and come back. She's got to take what she can get on the bus. And sometimes those are interesting trips. Stories that come with them. But
one of the things that when I was teaching my one course for AMLO, I talk about you have to think about how are you going to transport. And the fact is, we do have big grocery stores. We have Walmart here, but they're also real expensive.
Yeah.
And one of the decisions we did when we bought the house we did, and I have a podcast episode I'll link to in the show notes on that process, was my wife wanted all the little abarrotes and tiendas close by.
Right.
So she can just simply walk out the door, and she walks a block, and there's a vegetable stand.
Right.
Right?
And you guys are in the heart of Ajijic.
Right.
You're within walking distance of all those little things, of all the things that you need. We're kind of suburb.
Yep.
Ajijic. The growth is occurring out in this area, but it's, we've gotten very comfortable learning to take the bus. We realize that taking the bus into town with Mexicans is kind of fun. It's not, the cartoonish people there with chickens and all that other stuff. It's like a regular bus system. Works pretty well. But again, we have to plan that. I went to a physiologist today, and my appointment was 1. And I had to leave here at noon to get up to the bus stop to wait for the bus to get, so there's this, do we have bus fare? Do we have 10 peso coins? Things like, it's coming toward the end of the week on Friday. Do we have pesos to, pay for through the weekend? People don't, vendors down here don't take credit cards much. Many of them don't.
Many of them do, but
Or many of them, yeah. I was surprised our immigration attorney, when we were going through the immigration process, didn't take a credit card. But we had very reasonable rates as well in terms of paying her for, shepherding us through the system. So it's those kinds of things, and you don't just run up to the 7-Eleven ATM, because there is no 7-Eleven, and there is no ATM in the 7-Eleven. The ATM is in the bank, and by the time you get to the bank on a Friday afternoon, it may be empty.
Yep. Now, there may not be any 7-Elevens, but there are OXXOs.
OXXOs, right. But they don't have ATMs.
Right.
And so that, so there's these little things that you have to learn about what it's like to live down here.
Yep.
Who to order propane from for your stove and your hot water. Who to order water from, the big 5-gallon, jugs of water that we get that we can drink. When you buy a house and you have all these projects to do, who do you call to hang a picture or a piece of art on the wall, on a cement wall, because you didn't bring your tools down because we don't need them anymore. We'll get them down there. So it's those adjustments. They can pile on and accumulatively be stressful, but you just kind of have to go with the flow in that sense.
Yeah, I did a podcast episode on the adaptable mindset. And the fact is, in order to be successful, you have to be willing to adapt.
yeah.
And a great thing that Camille alluded to earlier is the expat community down here is incredibly generous with advice and with their time and their thoughts. So that's been really helpful as well.
Yeah, I like to think it's kind of like going off to college. When you went off to college, everybody was in the same boat.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that actually, I think, is because we all have this common thread, that we are all in the same position. And from what I've seen, most all of us have moved down here for political reasons, financial reasons, and the weather.
Yep.
And that seems to be the common thread. But because we're all here, it gives you, when you're walking down the street or you're sitting at a table in a restaurant, it's an immediate opener. So, wow, do you guys live here? Are you here full time? How long have you been here? Where do you live? Why'd you come? And all of a sudden, by the time you finish your meal, you've just made a new best friend forever.
Yep.
It doesn't happen like that in the States because there isn't this common thread.
Well, there's no question that the people who tend to come here tend to be more liberal-minded, more open-minded. There are people who come here who do it because they have to, because they have no money.
Right.
So you guys bought a house. How was that experience?
Well, the first thing it's different than the U.S., as you well know. And the first thing that's different is you don't get a mortgage down here. You pay cash. So that was like, oh, okay. And, we were fortunate to be able to do that.
And that was a very great thing because we have no mortgage and no rent. I mean,
Yep.
That was awesome.
It's like, and other than that, I think it was like a lot of other places, your realtor drives you around and you go look at houses and, afterwards you sit down in the evening with a margarita or a beer and you say, so do you remember that house, the second house we saw today? And I'll go, no, they all run together. And I remember doing the same thing in the U.S. So it's a lot similar to that. The no mortgage, when you finally negotiation was not a big deal here. We were fortunate to buy from the builder. This is a brand new house. The closing was different. There were like almost a dozen people in the Notorio's office. And everybody had to sign every piece of paper, and that was weird. Because in the U.S., they keep the seller and the buyer separate as much as they can. But it wasn't. Did you?
No, that what's been a challenge or challenging has been everything since then, and I don't think it has entirely everything to do with buying a house, but like the deed, and that the previous owner pays the electric until you have the deed and get the deed, and then the title, and then the name is transferred, and then you get to pay the electric, but then you have to figure out where you actually go to pay the electric. And from what a very wise, knowledgeable person who's sitting across from me has said, is you get the electric app, which is very difficult to load. All of a sudden now we have to get this thing called an RFC. So there are all these little things that in the States, it
was all done at closing.
It was all done.
Paper done,
And your realtor said, okay, now you need to get A, B, C, D, and E, so we're going to take care of it here. You walk out with a set of keys, and all you have to do is figure out what furniture is going in what room and where. But here, there have been a string of, I guess, administrative, I don't think they're really administrative, but...
The primary reason for that is they don't buy and sell real estate across Mexico like Americans do. We do here in communities like where there are a lot of expats, but you go through the rest of Mexico, people hold houses in their families for generations.
Yeah.
I think the one big lesson that I have learned in the 13, 14 months we've been here has been there's always one more piece of information that's required before this, whatever it is, can be finalized. Always. And you don't know it until you think you've got it all. And then they go, oh, Senior Woodard, you need copies of. And you can say even, do I need anything else? No, Senor, we're good to go. We'll see you on Tuesday, and you'll have, but there's always one more piece of information. And it's just something you have to, okay, fine, we'll get there, and we'll need something else. So that's a lot of what I think Camille's referring to. The deed was not ready for weeks after we had already done the closing. And then we had some situation where both of us had to be back in California for her family. And, then everybody was closed between Christmas and New Year's. And so, and then you need the deed to, as she said, to change over the account for the electric bill, to get the RFC. There's all kinds of bureaucratic stuff that you've got to go through, and there's always more information that you need that you thought you were all prepared for.
Yeah, the CFE bill or the electric bill, and CFE is the National Electric Company, the Nationalized Electric Company. That address is magic because that shows you actually own something or you lived there.
Proof of domiciles.
And so I was watching a YouTube video the one day about somebody down in the Yucatan who was off the grid. And so they didn't have an electric bill. They had more problems getting their property registered because they didn't have an electric bill.
Yeah. Huh.
Well, we love our electric bill. Love our electric bill because the several times we've paid it over the last year, it's been about $8 a month.
Yep.
Yeah. So we love our electric bill.
My electric bill right now is very high. I'm not sure why, but it's a total of $25 a month.
Oh, that is high.
Yeah.
Oh, my.
So
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Right. So, Scott, you are working.
I am.
How is that going?
So the work I do is remote, obviously. And it's been pretty seamless. You get an internet provider, and it's very different than in the States because you can choose among several providers as opposed to a provider who has a monopoly for a certain community. That gets kind of stressful because you have to try and figure out which is the better, and also which is better for where you are in the area. But once that's up and running, you've got an internet connection, you've got a Zoom app on your computer, and it's been pretty darn seamless, down here.
And you're coaching primarily people in the U.S.
Yep.
And your business is based in the U.S.
It is, yeah. And, I take a credit card from them, and it goes into my bank. And
your U.S. bank.
U.S. bank, exactly. If we do have a bank here in Mexico, an account here, and when we need to, we transfer money from our U.S. banks, credit unions to here. And we use an app to do that. And it's been, again, seamless. The internet down here there's been no complaining. If it has gone out, it's been maybe hours. But you know what? I don't mind that because I'm only paying $25-50 a month as opposed to $150 a month, when we were in Maine. So
the telephone service has been a little bit of a challenge. When you asked what's most stressful, that actually could be it. Because these walls are thick, they're cement, and
it's probably been our biggest challenge down here. And everybody has a solution that worked for them.
Yeah.
For some reason, it doesn't work for us. It is a pain in the butt. And even getting a house phone with this new house, which is really a voice over internet, works okay as long as you're 5 feet from the modem. But again, as Camille said, these houses are not constructed of wood, they're constructed of thick concrete. There's no heating, there's no cooling in these houses, at least not in ours. And even to walk out 15 feet onto our patio and have a call can be problematic. So we'll continue that battle, and we'll see how it goes. We're also I don't know if isolated is not the right word, but we none of our friends, none of our people we've come in contact with have, regardless of their cell provider, have great cell reception here. So until there's more growth and more houses being built, AT&T is not going to put another cell tower up, or Telcel is not going to put so yeah, the phone service has been
a challenge, but
we use WhatsApp, and that's what
texting works.
And because we've educated our kids in the States about WhatsApp, we don't have problems getting hold of them, on that as well.
Well, the goodness is your kids are educatable.
Yes. Well, on some things.
Yeah.
My wife's mother, who only has a flip phone, is not going to use WhatsApp.
My daughter is not going to use WhatsApp. Granddaughter will, of course, but she won't use it.
Yep. So.
Nor will my sister.
I was just going to say, we've had some resistance from folks, but but then they call on the house phone, and that's okay. But WhatsApp has been a godsend. It's probably the busiest app we have on our phones next to Google Translate.
Yeah, well, there's no question. Here, if you want to communicate with a business, you communicate over WhatsApp.
Right.
Right. When I was dealing with the Trek bicycle store in Guadalajara, I do it over WhatsApp.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I'm feeding it my English into Google Translate. Just do it in Spanish, and then cut and
pasted
paste in.
into the, yep. No. And most of the professional folks down here, doctors, lawyers, I don't know about accountants, have a WhatsApp
Yep.
number on their business card. So it's that part's okay. It's just regular cell service, and that's just, again, a learning curve.
So if someone wanted to reach out and contact you,
Yep. And it's Scott, SCOTT, at Scott Woodard, WOODARD, coaching.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn, which is probably a good way as well.
thank you for telling your story.
Well, thank you.
Because as I've said before, everyone does it a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone comes with a different background. There's no right way of doing it. What I thought I was impressed is the fact that you went and got help, because this can be quite overwhelming if you don't understand the fact that, yes, you have to get an RFC number, which is the equivalent of a Social Security number.
Right.
Well, you got that when you were a kid, or when you were 18, when you get your first job. Well, now you have to get it in. And as the one fellow I follow, Q. Paul, from Two Expats in Mexico, he says, anything you deal with the Mexican government will be arduous and slow.
Yeah.
Well, and they're still kind of making up some of that stuff as they go along. I mean,
Yeah.
the RFC process is pretty recent from what I understand. And there are all kinds of information floating on Facebook groups about, there's deadlines, but the deadline's been extended. And there's a lot of misinformation out there.
Yep.
And it's just been really good to be able to have access to people who can give you good information and who can walk you through that process. So we're not ashamed to say we'll take all the help we can get.
Well, I always tell people, for things like immigration, dealing with the government, pay somebody. Because a lot of people will get on Facebook and take advice there, and people will have their opinions become facts. And that information is as good as what you paid for it.
Right.
Nothing.
Right.
So,
Right.
well, Camille and Scott, thank you for being on the Repurpose Your Career podcast.
Well, thank you, Mark.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
I hope you found their perspective interesting and illuminating. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You'll get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. My most recent white paper, Ageism, the Last Acceptable Bias. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn. I am on Twitter at Career Pivot. I am not tweeting any longer. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-305. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.